Good evening. My name is Jonathan Greenblatt. I am the CEO and sixth National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in America. Founded in 1913 in the wake of the lynching of a Jewish man, Leo Frank, who was falsely accused of a crime, wrongfully convicted, and ultimately torn from his jail cell and hung from a tree by an angry mob. And after they murdered Leo Frank, the entire town gathered around and barbecued while his body still hung from the rope. They took photographs of the gruesome scene, turned them into postcards, and distributed them as souvenirs. At the turn of the century, the American Jewish community was weak and vulnerable, and the crime highlighted that weakness and vulnerability. It led a number of people to come together and say, we need to stop this. They subsequently created an organization that we now know as the Anti-Defamation League. And they wrote a charter for this new organization. We might call that a manifesto in today's vernacular. And in that document, they wrote the words that we still use today at ADL as our mission statement. The language hasn't changed in almost 110 years. They wrote the quote, "Our purpose is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all." Think about that for a moment. Now, it made sense for these individuals to come and stop the defamation of the Jewish people because in the year 1913, American Jews were legally prohibited from living in many places, kept out of universities by quotas, restricted from the professions they could work in, limited in their access to services like healthcare, unable to open a newspaper without seeing derision and slander. And so stopping the defamation of the Jewish people made sense for that community. But they also said, we will work to secure justice and fair treatment to all. These individuals realized, invoking the words of the ancient sage Hillel, that if I am not for myself, who will be? But if I am only for myself, what am I? That the Jewish people could only be free when all people are free. That only when all minorities are safe could the Jewish minority be safe. In today's vernacular, in today's nomenclature, we might call that intersectionality. Perhaps others might refer to it as social justice and the interconnectedness of struggles. But in 1913, that was a bold and courageous proposition. It was an audacious goal to think that this small, weak, and vulnerable community could one day be strong and stand tall for others. And yet it is that duality, it is that integrated vision of justice which has animated this organization for over a century. It is what compelled it to make America not only a safer place for its Jewish people, but a better place for Black Americans, for Asian Americans, for LGBTQ Americans, and for all people, regardless of their faith or race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, level of ability. ADL is founded on this core idea that we truly should be judged by the content of our character, not based on how we look or where we pray or who we love. So it is in this context of fighting for civil rights, fighting for social justice, combating extremism, pushing back against prejudice and hate, that makes it such an honor for me to be here and addressing all of you about the dire threat posed to this country by gun violence, including the scourge of mass shootings in recent years, particularly at the hands of domestic extremists. Look, we know that violence can come in many forms. We know that threats can emerge through multiple vectors. And we know that people can bring harm through multiple means. But at ADL, we have a world-class team of experts investigating extremist threats from across the ideological spectrum. And we see, again and again and again, that those threats are on the rise, increasingly enabled and expanded upon by gun violence. At the top of the pyramid of hate, which is this sociological construct that we use to think about modalities of prejudice, how there is a hierarchy and how hate can escalate up that pyramid unless it is confronted. At the top of that pyramid, which starts with biased attitudes and moves up to biased attitudes could be, thoughts of prejudice. It could be stereotypes. It could be fear of differences. Then you go up that pyramid to acts of bias, which could be something as small as a quote unquote microaggression. It could be insensitive remarks. It could be bias or bullying. These are individual acts of bias. You go up the pyramid further and you escalate to systemic discrimination, where the bias moves from an attitude to an act, and then from an act to a policy. Think about our criminal justice system. Think about the equities or inequities in our education system. Think about the lack of equal opportunity in housing. Systemic biases permeate these systems. Then it moves from there to bias-motivated violence. This could start with something as quote-unquote innocuous as a threat, although I would say the threat of violence is not innocuous, to actual acts of assault or rape or even murder committed against someone, again, because of who they are, an immutable characteristic. And then at the top of that pyramid are what we call genocide, the systemic marginalization and annihilation of a people, again, because of their identity. Now, extreme incidents of gun violence, terror attacks, often involving military-style assault weapons, like what we saw in the tragic shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in suburban Pittsburgh 3.5 years ago, or the massacre of Latinos in El Paso in 2019, or the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, some 6 years ago, or more recently, the hostage attack in Colleyville, Texas, this past January, where 4 individuals, including a rabbi, were taken hostage in a suburb outside of Dallas, or the shooting at the Tops supermarket in Buffalo, New York, that targeted the African American community. These are all the kind of hideous, violent acts that were enabled by firearms in the hands of bigots and extremists. Our research indicates that guns are consistently the most common weapon of choice for extremists intent on committing deadly acts, whether, again, those are hate crimes or terror attacks or other acts of lethal violence. Every year in the United States, domestic extremists choose firearms as their weapon of choice. In fact, year after year, more people are killed by extremists using firearms than any other device or weapon. Over the past decade, firearm deaths constituted the great majority of all extremist-caused deaths, nearly every year. ADL has been tracking extremists since the 1930s. And we've been monitoring hate crimes, the anti-Semitic incidents, since the 1970s. And our data demonstrates overwhelmingly that right-wing extremists were responsible for the majority of domestic extremist-related murders in 2021. These could be white supremacists, anti-government activists, armed militia members, violent incels, and other right-wing extremists. They were linked to at least 25 murders in 2021, and they've been responsible for upwards of 75% of extremist-related homicides in the past 25 years. White supremacists killed more people in 2021 than any other type of extremist. Nearly half of the deaths last year, 13 innocent lives, were taken by white supremacists. And in 2021, 83% of the extremist-related deaths were connected to firearms, continuing the trend of extremists choosing firearms as their weapon of choice year after year after year. And in the past decade, shootings accounted for 75% of the deaths that occurred at the hands of extremists. And look, these aren't just numbers. Every figure here, every statistic, every percentage, every decimal represents an individual human life, a person with goals and desires and futures, a man or a woman with a family, with a mother and a father, with a brother or a sister, with a son or a daughter. And these are lives that were cut short by bullets for no explicable reason. And so this data underscores an indisputable fact. Far-right extremists pose the greatest terror threat to the United States in our present time. This threat is deadlier than ever because of the ready availability and access of firearms. Firearms are easy to use and readily available and accessible to most extremists, with the exception of the youngest juveniles or those with felony convictions. And even those boundaries can be crossed with just a little bit of effort. In the absence of meaningful gun control measures, our experts at ADL predict that extremist gun violence will continue to take a toll each year. They seem poised to grow. And in years with shooting sprees, in years where we see mass casualty events, in years where we see acts of terror at scale, you can guess that the toll will be especially high. We are particularly troubled by the rise of domestic violent extremism, which again includes white supremacists, but also, garden variety accelerationists. These are individuals who want to catalyze civil war, armed militia groups, involuntary celibates, also known as incels, sovereign citizens, and other groups that demonize all minorities, but have a particular animus directed at the Jewish people. They dehumanize Jews. They denigrate Judaism. They believe the Jewish people are at the heart of some nefarious conspiracy to commit white genocide or to occupy the government. They traffic entire tropes that have been used to persecute and wound Jewish people over centuries. It's why we call anti-Semitism the oldest hatred. It has been around for 2,000 years, but it has sort of attained a lethal character in the context of the widespread, almost ubiquity, if you will, of firearms in America. Like the shooter in Buffalo, some of these actors trumpet the hate-filled great replacement theory that posits a cabal of Jewish people are engaged in white genocide. It is a frightening fiction and yet one that has remarkable traction because it has been mainstreamed in recent years, as some prominent right-wing voices have sort of hate laundered this idea, shepherded it from the margins right into the mainstream through primetime television, talk radio, and social media, giving currency to the outlandish, grotesque claim and entirely basis that some Jewish philanthropists are seeking to flood America with migrants or non or people of color or whatnot. It is groundless, it is grotesque, and yet again, as I said, it is actually increasing in its span. From Charlottesville to Capitol Hill, the Great Replacement Theory, facilitated and exacerbated by gun violence, has played out with deadly results. At ADL, we believe that it's crucial to limit the power of extremists and others who pose a violent threat to society, and that effective gun control legislation can do just that. ADL has long been an advocate for strong, effective, and sensible gun violence prevention measures, with an eye toward keeping these deadly weapons out of the hands of extremists. Since 1967, ADL has favored expanded federal and state regulation of the sale and transfer of firearms and other deadly weapons, by the way, including assault weapons, for which there can be no civilian application. For decades, ADL has supported federal and state initiatives designed to raise awareness and make it more difficult for dangerous extremists to access guns, including more stringent background checks, longer waiting periods, restrictions on high-capacity ammunition clips, and a ban on the import and sale of assault weapons. At ADL, we also support research on new and safer technologies and better data collection on the causes and prevention of gun violence. We strongly support efforts to close gaps in the current regulatory system that allow the trafficking of illegal guns or ghost guns that may enable people with felony convictions or minors or persons with mental illness or other prohibited individuals to access firearms. We believe that America can enact these reforms and do so with fidelity toward the Second Amendment, without restricting the constitutional rights of Americans, even as we also can do so without stigmatizing those who suffer from mental illness. There is a path forward that doesn't involve demonizing lawful and peaceful gun owners, that supports the needs of people with mental illness. Along with our many coalition partners, through organizations like the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations or the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights Organizations, we continue to push for responsible gun safety and violence prevention laws and regulations at the federal, state, and local level to combat this epidemic of extremism and the threat of gun violence. We owe it to the families and friends of those killed and wounded and everyone who's been personally affected, and the countless others who've been traumatized by these tragedies. It is long past the time when we can simply condemn the Sandy Hook or Charleston or Pittsburgh or Uvalde shooters and mourn the victims. Thoughts and prayers from elected officials or community leaders are no longer enough. We owe it to those victims and to ourselves to find a way to meaningfully advance gun safety efforts before another tragedy befalls us. Now, before I close, I'd like just to take an opportunity to remind everyone who might be watching of the deadly impact of extremist gun violence and the toll that it's taken in just recent years on families and communities and our country. Here are some of the deadliest incidents the death toll, and the weapons used in the assault. Buffalo, New York, May 14th, 2022. 10 dead at a supermarket. Bushmaster XM15 purchased illegally from a gun dealer in New York. Atlanta, March 16th, 2021. 8 dead in a shooting rampage at 3 massage businesses owned by Asian Americans. 9mm handgun purchased just hours before the attack. Jersey City, December 10th, 2019. 4 killed, including 3 at a kosher grocery store, as well as 1 Jersey City police detective. They were murdered with an AR-15 style assault rifle and a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun. Other weapons recovered at the scene included a 9mm Ruger and a 9mm Glock 17 and a .22 caliber Mark IV with a silencer. El Paso, Texas, August 13, 2019. 23 people were killed at a Walmart. They were murdered with an AK-47 style rifle and 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition purchased just 6 weeks earlier. Poway, California, April 27th, 2019. 1 woman killed and 3 injured inside a Chabad congregation in Poway, California, just outside San Diego. She was murdered and they were wounded by a shooter with an AR-15 assault rifle that fortunately jammed before more people could be killed. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, October 27th, 2018. 11 people murdered with a Colt AR-15 SP1 and 3 Glock 357 handguns. These individuals were praying at the Tree of Life Synagogue on a Shabbat morning. Orlando, Florida, July 2016. 49 killed at the Pulse nightclub. They were murdered by a shooter with an AR-15 style rifle, a 6-hour MCX, and another handgun. Charleston, South Carolina, June 17, 2015. 9 worshipers murdered at the AME Baptist Church, including a pastor and a state senator. They were killed by a shooter with a Glock 41 and a .45 caliber handgun. Chattanooga, Tennessee, 2015. 5 service members killed at a United States Naval Reserve Center. The shooter used an AK-47 rifle and a 9mm handgun. San Bernardino, California, December 2nd, 2015. 14 people killed in a terror attack committed by an Islamic fundamentalist targeting a holiday gathering after the shooter pledged allegiance to the terror group Islamic State. The husband and wife assailants used 2 AR-15 style rifles that had been bought by a third party. These were all incidents where shooters were motivated by extremism to murder office workers, service members, Black Americans, LGBTQ Americans, Jewish Americans, Latinos and Latino Americans, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and again, essentially anyone who didn't conform to their warped, bigoted worldview. And so we at ADL join the People's Filibuster and demand that our elected leaders come up with strategies to deal with this epidemic of gun violence plaguing our country. It is outrageous in a nation such as ours that teachers and children can't go to school, that parishioners or worshipers can't attend a church or a synagogue, and that everyday people, ordinary Americans, can't even go to the grocery store without fear of being shot. This must end, and we call upon our legislators to take advantage of this moment and enact meaningful gun safety legislation once and for all. Thank you.